Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today, I am on with Dr. Carolyn Osiek. We're going to be talking about women in ministry, specifically in the early church. So, that's early Christianity, all the way up to 5, 6, 700, maybe even a little 800 AD, and really interesting stuff. Actually, women serving in leadership, which is a really big surprise to a lot of people. So, how are you doing today, Dr. Osiek?
I'm just fine. How are you, Zach?
I'm doing great. Alrighty. So you wrote a book with another scholar on this very topic.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And it was called Women. What was it? Yeah, Ordained Women in the
Ordained
Early
women in
Church.
the early church. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously that was a big topic, was women being ordained in ministry. Before we get into that, I did want to ask you, could you just give a summary of the book, just so people have a general idea of what we're talking about today,
Mm-hmm.
and just what you guys were arguing in the book?
Well, I became aware sometime before that of the number of interesting pieces of literary evidence and epigraphical evidence about women deacons.
Hmm.
And I thought, wouldn't that be interesting to collect all this material and make it available? There were pieces that certainly had been published, but not brought all together.
Hmm.
And I had a colleague at the same time, Kevin Madigan, who has since moved elsewhere, who was much better at the Latin than I was, and I'm more of a Greek person. And so I thought, this is a perfect combination. He was very interested in it. So that's what we did. And we made the collection. And actually, it was the editor at Johns Hopkins University Press who gave it the name Ordained Women in the Early Church. And it was published it was 2005. So that's quite some time ago.
Yep.
So I'm trying to, as we were preparing for this, I'm trying to remember all this.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So what would you say, like, the main arguments were, or the main topics? Like, obviously deacons, there was some about presbyters, right? Just the main general topics there you guys talked about.
Well, the collection was to show how prevalent these roles were in many parts of the early church through the centuries. And there were a couple of things that we disproved. I mean, one was that there's any difference in the terms for women, between diakonos and diakonissa and diakone. They're used interchangeably, and so there's no difference there. Another was that eventually it was simply that superiors of women's monastic congregations were just called deacons. And that's certainly not true either. There are cases where there are women deacons in the communities, but they're not the superior. So it was a different role. So there are things like that we tried to say, hey, it's a little bit more nuanced than a lot of people think.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, you guys did a great job of collecting so many texts. I'm sure that took so much time to put all those things together and then give an analysis of each of them.
And
Yeah.
one of the questions was, shall we include the original texts of the Greek especially? Well, it would have made the book a lot more expensive. And and we just thought that we give the sources. And if there's something that was really, really in some remote place, then we do give the text. But for the most part, people who are seriously interested can look them up themselves. So.
Oh, interesting. Oh, that's something I never would have thought about. Yeah, that's cool.
That was a big question when we were putting it together.
Yeah, very fascinating. Okay, so yeah, as I was saying, ordained, and so I mainly grew up in a Reformed Protestant denomination. So the question of what is ordained and all that stuff is not really something I've ever even asked myself. So that's a big something for me, but as well as other people. So could you talk about what it means to be ordained?
Yeah, that's quite a question. I would say generally it means to be designated in some way, officially designated for church leadership. And that in some traditions that's done by consensus of a local community, which is kind of what it looks like it was going on in the New Testament. And in other cases, it's official designation by a founder or a person with from outside the community who has the authority to do it.
Mm,
So there are many different ways in which it's practiced. There are many different ways in which it is initiated. So, but basically, it's selection for church leadership, I would say.
interesting. Okay, alrighty. And off the cuff question there. So being ordained, I guess I guess there's different ways that they've done it. In like,
Mm-hmm.
I guess another way to say it is like, how do we even know when someone's ordained in an early church? It's like, oh, putting on of hands, or
Mm-hmm.
does it they'll
Yeah,
actually specifically say the word?
the laying on of hands is the traditional gesture, and you have that, for instance, in Acts, where Paul will lay hands on local leaders before he
Mm-hmm.
leaves. There's a reference in Second Timothy to the laying on of my hands on you. But the laying on of hands is not only for ordination; it's for other things as well. But that is certainly the gesture that is usually
Mm-hmm.
considered official. There are two terms for it in Greek: hierotonia or hierothesia, and both mean putting hands on. And there's been some argument that the two words are different, but I don't think it holds up. I think
Mm-hmm.
it really is, they're two words for the same thing.
Interesting. Okay, so that gets onto the other topic of, so there's a debate on women deacons, female deacons,
Mm-hmm.
I guess specifically in the Catholic Church right now. I'm not informed
Mm-hmm.
in any way at all, but it's the question of whether they were sacramentally ordained
Mm-hmm.
or I guess just a normal ordained. So could you talk about that debate just a little bit and what's the difference there? How do you think we should look at it?
Yeah, well, you have to start with an understanding of what is sacrament. And uh, uh, I think almost every tradition considers baptism and Eucharist as some kind of important act,
Hmm.
ritual that creates the community and brings people into the community. And that's the idea of sacrament. In the Catholic Church through Trent in the 16th century, partly in response to the Reformation,
Hmm.
there developed the idea of seven sacraments, and that the biblical number seven.
Yep.
In the old what we call the Baltimore Catechism, the old collection of questions and answers that you taught kids. What is a sacrament? A sacrament is an outward sign instituted by Christ to give grace. So it's an outward sign. It's a ritual of some kind.
Hmm.
In both baptism and Eucharist, you can understand that there's something there that is repeated as part of the tradition.
Hmm.
Instituted by Christ, in the sense that it is Christ who wills it to be practiced in the church, to give grace. In other words, to facilitate the connection of people with God. And ordination to the diaconate and the priesthood are understood to be sacraments. The ordination is one of the seven sacraments. So
Hmm.
sacramentally ordained means having actually participated in, received the sacrament of ordination. And sometimes the argument is there are minute kinds of analyses of the texts. There are rituals for the ordination of a deacon, of a deaconess, presbyter, etc. And sometimes there are minute analyses, and they want to say, well, this means it's sacramental ordination, and this doesn't. And so there are a lot of arguments, and they're in the hands of liturgical historians, which I am not. So that's a long answer, I think, to your question.
Hmm.
What sacramental ordination means.
Okay, so a lot of times in these discussions, like they'll show a maybe like a female deacon or something,
Mm-hmm.
and someone will say, "Well, that's not sacramental ordination. That's just
That's right.
normal ordination. So,
That's right.
what is normal ordination if that's sacramental?
Well, you see, then you go into the argument, which has been very well made, I think, that in the early years of the church, nobody was sacramentally ordained.
Huh.
That idea simply had not developed,
Hmm.
and that's where there's argument that doesn't happen until the 12th century, and in which case, now if you're arguing about whether women were sacramentally ordained in the early church, you have to go a layer below that and say, what is sacramental ordination anyway, and when did it really develop? You know,
Hmm.
so, it
Interesting.
involves all of those questions.
Yeah. Okay. So, uh, I'm trying to uh, look into the mind. Like, this is specifically Catholic churches, would you say, that do this, or are there other churches that do this as well?
What's the this now?
Like the ordination, or specifically like the sacramental ordination.
Um, Catholics of the Orthodox churches.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I would probably say some of the higher church Protestants.
Okay. Yeah. Like Anglican, would you say?
Mhm, mhm.
I see. Okay.
I
All
can't
right.
speak for Anglicans, but yes, as
Yeah.
far as I know.
Okay. Okay. Appreciate it. All right. So when you say like the 12th century, are you thinking specifically like the Catholic Church or just all churches in general?
Well, 12th century. Hey, this is before the Reformation. It's all of
Mhm.
us.
Yeah, I see. Yep, I see what you did there. There you
Yeah.
go. All right. That's awesome. Okay. So like, you that seems significant, the whole sacramental thing, but like, why would that be so special to make that distinction by so many people, that like the early people in the early church before 12th century weren't sacramentally ordained? Why
Mhm.
would that be specific, like, or like special, like, being sacramentally ordained, does that make you leader, and you can't be a leader without being sacramentally ordained? Like, that wouldn't follow, right?
No, that wouldn't follow. No, no. I think basically it's a way of excluding the possibility of women
Hmm.
in orders, because if you say that women were sacramentally ordained, then women can be sacramentally ordained again, and we are opening the whole idea of ordination to women.
Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting, because I did read an article that said literally that basically it's like, oh, if we have to look into female deacons, then when we have to look at other, the higher priests and all that. And it's like, well, I mean,
Yeah,
that's.
even though those who are today proponents of
Mhm.
the diaconate for women argue very clearly that is not so, that the
Mhm.
diaconate is a distinct role that does not open the way to presbyteral ordination, priestly ordination.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, so we talked about deacons. I guess some people might have an idea what they are. I know in the New Testament it's often used, the word's just servant, basically.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, could you talk about what it meant to be a woman deacon
Well,
in
first of all,
in
let's talk about deacon period, huh?
Okay,
Uh,
yeah, go, okay.
diakonos is the word, and it is a word that's commonly used in the society around them, and it has two connotations, sort of going in two different directions. One of them is servant, not as distinct from slave. Okay,
Hmm.
so um, not forced labor, but a kind of a rendering of service.
Hmm.
And the other piece of it is representation or agency. So, for example, a person who is engaged in business dealings will have a diakonos who could be a slave or not. I mean,
Hmm.
that's irrelevant, but is authorized to enact business dealings for this person. So an agent or a representative.
Hmm.
And I think that meaning, that second meaning, also has to carry over when we're dealing with people who are diakonos in the New Testament. Now, can also be used figuratively, and Paul will do that. He's a diakonos of Christ or a diakonos of God, whatever. But there, remember that double-pronged meaning, that not only rendering service but also representing the authority. So it is used figuratively, certainly. And when Paul calls himself a diakonos, he certainly does not mean he's ordained, But it does seem as if in the very early years, in the Pauline years, this was one of the titles that was developing for people who were rendering pastoral service. And the one person in the New Testament who is called a diakonos by name is a woman, and that is Phoebe in Romans 16:1. She's a diakonos of the church of Cenchreae, which is one of the seaports of Corinth. So this is not figurative. This is saying she's got this title for whatever role she's doing in that church at Cenchreae. She's also a prostatis, a benefactor, and that's another whole thing.
Yeah.
So we've got a person who is called a diakonos. Now you have to put that up against Philippians 1:1, where Paul is addressing the people in Philippi with the episkopoi and diakonoi. Episkopos is another word that means a kind of a superintendent or manager, and is coming to be a title in the church. So let's not focus on that. Let's focus on the diakonoi. Philippi has a group of people who have the title diakonos. Okay, so given the fact that Phoebe is a diakonos, and it's the male masculine word that's used there, they haven't developed deaconess yet in one church, and then you've got a naming or a reference to in Philippi diakonoi, means that you can't assume that in Philippi that they're all men, because we have the example of a woman. So elsewhere. So what it means, I think, is that this title is developing for some role. What role? We don't know, except that Phoebe is traveling from Corinth to Rome and carrying the letter. And Paul is introducing her. Is she a representative of the Church of Corinth to Rome? Or is she going on her own business, or what? We don't know. But it does seem as if she has some kind of a leadership role with that. Okay, so what's a deacon? That's the beginning, and then it develops into a role of service and representation. And as the titles presbyter and episkopos, which eventually becomes bishop, develop, the diakonos is not the top person there, but is somebody who is what we say later on is that the deacon is the hands of the bishop, the one who carries out things that the bishop wants done, and particularly the ministry of to the poor and the suffering, and visiting the sick, etc. And so it's this whole ministry of mercy, and the ministry of the social ministry of the church. Deacons also eventually are those who guard the doors, who seek people in the right place. It's all of that kind of thing. And so it seems that in certain places there are men and women who are exercising this ministry.
Okay. And there seems to be, you mentioned the word deaconess, technically diakon, is it?
Diaconissa.
You're right. And that's not used until later.
That's right.
Do we have any idea what the reason for that was?
Why?
Or what was the specific time when that changed?
Yeah. By the 3rd century, maybe late 2nd, there is this ministry of the female diaconate that has developed, particularly in the East, in Syria. And it is a ministry to women, of women, by women, to women. And I think it begins probably with the baptismal ritual, the baptism, it's adult baptism.
Hmm.
And I don't know if you've seen any of the archaeological evidence for baptistries. They're places with steps going down so that you stand in it up to waist high about, and then water is poured over your head. And it seems as if people being baptized completely took off all clothes, so they're nude as they go down into the baptismal font. And this, of course, is not appropriate for a male deacon when it's a woman being baptized. And so it seems as if that is the beginning role for the deaconess there, which it is the assisting in baptism and the carrying out of the anointing of the body, etc. But more than that, also the pastoral world, the preparation of women for baptism, the follow-up afterwards, the visiting of sick women, really a pastoral role to women. We also have some evidence of them being sort of chaperones for women going to speak to the bishop, chaperones for women who are traveling, pilgrims. And so it's a kind of an expanded role for of a ministry to women, and that's what the deaconess does.
Okay. And so that's specifically deaconess. So does that mean that
However, they are also sometimes called deacon. That's why I'm saying
interesting?
that the terms are interchangeable. But
Uh,
deaconess, the term deaconess is not used till about the 3rd century.
okay, interesting.
Mhm.
So in this time period, would you say that once they started using the deaconess word, that only women were deaconesses and only men were deacons, or
Yeah,
I?
diaconissa is a feminine form.
Mm,
Yeah, no men are called deaconesses. No.
okay, I see.
Deacon, deaconess, you know how we do that,
Mhm.
with other words. I can't think of an
Sure.
example right now, but you know what I mean. Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's not like it is in the New Testament, right? With Phoebe.
No, no,
Interesting.
it's a
Okay.
diakonos. It's the
Yeah.
it's the masculine word because the other has not developed yet.
Interesting. Okay.
Mm.
And but once this word deaconess starts getting used,
Mhm.
is there a differentiation in roles? Like, as obviously you said, the baptism was one of it.
Mhm.
Is there any other distinctions there?
Yeah, I think there are, given the society. I mean, if you know how the society worked, uh, women were not, for example, sent out by themselves to into somebody's home to visit sick men. I mean, it didn't happen that way. And so the male deacon was more kind of an implementer. It was a question of a business deal on the part of the church. It would be a man who would be sent, not a woman. So yeah, in keeping with the differences in the society,
Mhm.
sure, there were
Yeah.
differences.
Okay. There's a question of leadership in this discussion, like,
Mhm.
women being leaders, stuff like that. But in these descriptions of the deacons and deaconesses, I haven't heard you say anything about leadership specifically. So were they leaders, or how would you define that?
How do you define leader?
Oh, that's a good
Really,
question.
it's a very loose word.
Mm,
Uh, yeah, I mean, a woman who is going into a deaconess who is going into a home to visit
mm,
sick women and is consoling them and trying praying for healing, etc. Is that leadership? In a certain way, it is. If you're talking about standing in front of a congregation and preaching, no,
mm,
women did not do that. Um, but then male deacons didn't either.
mm,
Okay, it would be the bishop who would do that.
mm,
So how do you define leadership?
Interesting. Yeah. And there's also a discussion like women leaders, I guess, in the early church were only leaders of women. And not men. Do you see any distinction there?
Well, yeah, I do. Yeah, by the third and fourth century. Go back to Phoebe for a minute in the
Mm,
50s of the first century, and we don't know. I mean, she's also called a prostatis, a benefactor, and benefactors were that isn't just somebody like who gives money to the museum or the concerts. That is someone who is in a position of social status and is able to provide protection and introduction to networking and all that kind of thing. And Paul says she's his prostatis of many people, including myself. So you have somebody there who is of uh, pretty distinguished social status
mhm,
and therefore does exercise leadership, certainly in her own household, and probably somehow in the church community. So, but now fast forward to the third century and the Syrian deaconesses, and no, it would not be that same kind of leadership of public speaking or public appearances. No, because
mm,
that just wasn't done in the society
mm.
at large. You know.
Interesting. Oh, well, could you talk about that just a little bit more? So the society at large, you're talking about like the third, fourth century,
Mhm.
that they didn't go up and do sermons, or what, or deacons specifically? What are you talking about there?
Deacon, and no, I mean the preaching was done by the bishop,
Yep. Okay.
not and nobody else.
I see. All right. Okay.
So,
That makes
so
sense.
that's what you mean by leadership. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Uh-huh.
It's a very specific definition of leadership.
Hmm.
Yeah, and I guess leadership and teaching, I guess. Yeah.
Well, my working definition of leadership, completely out of this context, is the ability to cause or prevent change.
Hmm.
Now,
Interesting.
that in a church meeting, maybe that doesn't quite apply, but in general, in
Hmm.
society, I think that's kind of a working definition or understanding of
Hmm.
leadership.
Interesting. Okay. So so we talked about there. It seems like there was always women deacons. Was there a specific location that there were women deacons, and then in other locations there weren't, or is it? It's
Well, we certainly know of their not only existence but flourishing in the Eastern Church. So,
okay.
Syria, Palestine, in that area particularly. But you know that adage, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Hmm.
you know,
Right.
uh, and that applies to anything. Who would have thought that there was this vast collection of ancient texts, first century biblical and other texts, hidden in a cave near the Dead Sea until
Okay.
they were discovered.
Right.
Um, so we can say where we have the evidence, but that of anything, we're talking about anything now, not
Hmm.
just women deacons. That doesn't mean that they didn't exist somewhere else. We
Hmm.
just don't have the evidence. But the evidence is for the Eastern Church more than the West, and I think that probably has to do with the more how shall I put it, the greater distinction between public and private, and the ways in which women were not expected to appear in public. That runs all the way through the culture,
Hmm.
um, tends to be more in the East traditionally than in the West. I mean, and you can still see some of that today in the differences in culture.
Hmm. Okay. So in your book, you specifically said, or I don't know if it was you or your co-author,
Hmm.
but you said no evidence of female deacons in the West until the fifth century.
Hmm.
But that just because we don't have it doesn't mean that it specifically didn't exist.
That's right.
So would you be confident saying that it just wasn't as popular?
Well, I think there wasn't the same felt need.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. All right. So another interesting thing you said in the writings was the Western epigraphical evidence for female deacons is slim, probably because of the vagaries of inscriptional survival in view of the efforts of councils of the
Hmm.
5th and 6th centuries to eliminate them.
Yeah, yeah.
The canons and episcopal letters below on access of women to the altar should also be compared. That so much effort was given to suppression has to indicate more of a custom than the few inscriptions and literary references reveal. So I see you're saying that there are a lot of texts where we can see that people later on were trying to eliminate them,
Yeah,
scratch them out, stuff like
yeah.
that.
Church councils. Our best evidence for women deacons in the West is the church councils who are saying, we're not going to do this. We don't want it. You know?
Yeah.
Well, you don't spend energy saying that unless, unless it's there,
Hmm.
unless it's actually happening.
Mm.
So, yeah, it's kind of ghost evidence, that there was something going on there. We
Hmm.
just don't have the lovely inscriptional evidence.
Mm. So, so let's talk about that. So I guess if you have like a tombstone that
Mhm.
has uh, Junia, the deaconess,
Mhm,
so
mhm.
you're saying like someone would cross that out, cross out the word deaconess, so just a Junia, right?
No, it's just that we don't have, I mean, the surviving inscriptional epigraphical evidence of anything is so slim.
Hmm.
It's accidental that these things survive. So it's um, we just know that there's much more that didn't survive
Mm.
in case of if anything we're talking about here.
Mm.
Do you want to put Sophia on the screen?
Sure, let's do it. All right, good old Sophia.
Yeah, this is an inscription. It's from the east, from Jerusalem. Actually, it was discovered on the Mount of Olives, something like 1903. I mean, very fairly recently as these things go.
Hmm.
And it's large, and the bottom is broken off. It would be 4 to 5 feet, I would say, high, and about the same wide. And it's here lies the slave, the doule. It's the feminine word for slave, and the bride of Christ. So she's a celibate, Sophia, and she's diakonos, and the whole word diakonos is
Hmm.
spelled out in the third line on the right side, and second Phoebe, and that's a thing that's done often, the second such and such, which compares her to an illustrious person of the past, which is Phoebe from
Mm.
Romans 16, who slept in peace, which is the way of saying died,
Mm.
and then it gives the date. And there's something else at the bottom that's broken off. It's probably something like "May the Lord God have mercy on her" or something like that. So it's a woman named Sophia, and she's called a diakonos. And this is probably fourth century. It's thought to be fourth century, a time when Jerusalem was a thriving center of pilgrimage.
Hmm.
So it doesn't say she was a deacon of what church. She may have been a pilgrim who died there, or she may have been someone who was a resident
Hmm.
and perhaps connected with the Church of the Anastasis of the Resurrection, which is now
Hmm.
called Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And so unfortunately, we don't know anything else about her. But this is one of these pieces of evidence that's really interesting. That we know a name of a woman who lived there, lived and died there.
Hmm. Okay, but so this is Jerusalem. I'm not an expert on maps or anything like that. You talk about the West seems to not have a lot of evidence for
Mhm.
women deacons, but the East does. Yeah, surviving
Surviving
evidence.
graphical
Yeah.
evidence. Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
But this is in the East or is this in the West?
This is East Jerusalem.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I thought. Okay. So
Mhm.
So yeah, this is one of the examples of evidence in the East, but there's also a lot of evidence in the East compared to
Yes,
the West,
yes,
right?
there is, and that's the whole collection in the book is, all of these deaconess or female deacon
Mm,
inscriptions and literary references too.
okay, very interesting. All right, um, so so I mentioned that the idea like maybe someone was like scratching off the word deacon, deaconess,
Yeah, I don't know of
and
any. I can't think of any evidence of
okay,
any.
all
But
right,
it's
so
certainly done in other
yeah.
inscriptions though when they don't like it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, when you and your co-writer mentioned the word like suppression or, um, you know, eliminate them, I guess eliminate maybe would have just been the role in general. But what do you
Attempts
mean
to
by what
suppress
do you
them.
mean by suppression there?
Well, when you have a decree of an Episcopal conference that says we're not going to do this,
Okay,
um, attempting to eliminate.
I
Mhm.
see. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Alrighty, and so then you have the topic of presbyters. So this is really
Mhm.
interesting.
Mhm.
So let's see here. Yeah, before we talk about evidence for women presbyters, like what is a presbyter? Like, what
Yeah,
were their roles?
good question. The word, of course, simply means elder.
Okay.
A presbyteros is an older person, and presbytera is the feminine. And certainly there are some situations in which the word simply means that, means an older person. And so you have to be very careful to try to interpret context. Beyond that, presbyter, presbyteros comes to mean a sort of, in the church, a council of elders, a council of experienced people, men, when you're talking about the presbyteros,
Mm,
presbyteroi, um, who are the advisory council for the bishop. And by the fourth century, well into the fourth century, the Christian population moves out more from the cities into the countryside, into the small towns. And it seems as if, and the first place where this is happening is North Africa. The you need somebody who's a kind of a leader, the pastoral leader, and the presbyteroi then move out and into the countryside, and they actually become the representatives of the bishop for a local community. And this then evolves into the pastorate, the uh, leadership in local communities. So presbyteros is the word for that role in Greek communities. Well into the Middle Ages,
mm,
replaced eventually in the Catholic tradition by priest. But in the earlier texts, I mean, you can get translations that say priest, and the word is presbyteros, the elder. So
mm.
so it's an evolving role. Mhm.
Okay. And there's also the word overseer. That would be the same, or would that be different?
Yeah, overseer is, well, no. Overseer is usually understood to be episkopos,
Okay, I see.
episkopos, which becomes bishop. Okay,
Right.
and we have trouble with translations. Philippians 1:1. I mean, you're a Bible translator. What are you going to do with episkopoi and diakonoi? Bishops and deacons is totally anachronistic, but it's the word. It's the same word. So overseers and ministers, overseers and agents, servants. I mean, it's a headache for translating.
Mm.
Um, because it's so contextual.
So what you're saying is in this Philippians text of the Bible,
Mm.
there is the mention of it, but that role specifically might not have been the same role that was used later for those same people. Is that what you're referring to?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Yeah.
Okay,
While we're on that subject,
sure.
with Phoebe in Romans 16:1 or 2, it
Mm,
is absolutely incorrect to translate that as deaconess
mm,
because the term deaconess had not yet evolved.
mm.
Okay, she should be deacon.
Right.
If
Yeah,
you're
that.
gonna
Mhm.
if in Philippians, especially because if in Philippians 1:1 you're gonna say deacons, diakonoi, then you got to say deacon for Phoebe too.
Yeah, makes sense.
Okay,
Okay, so
back on presbyters.
okay. So, did you get a chance to talk about their roles?
Yeah, about presbytery. Yeah, I was talking about how they became eventually the leaders in local churches. But if they are presbytery in the city where the bishop is, it's like a council.
Hmm.
Um, Whereas the deacon seems to have a different role. The deacon is the one who goes out and does things, And the presbyter, it's hard to figure out actually what the presbyters do before they, what are they doing all day before they go out and become local leaders. So the presbyteri, the female
Hmm.
presbyters. Yeah. Everything depends on what you think a presbyter actually did. And is the presbytera, the female presbyter, doing the same thing?
Hmm.
So let me just quote from this famous letter of Bishop Gelasius of Rome. This is in the 490s, and he's writing to the bishops of southern Italy, to
Hmm.
Calabria. And now these are people bishops with whom he's in contact, And he says, "We've heard to our distress that contempt of divine things has reached such a state that women are encouraged to serve at the sacred altars and to perform all the other tasks that are assigned only to the service of men, and for which women are not appropriate." Okay, so Gelasius in Rome has heard that something's going on in Calabria, in South Italy, that he does not approve of. That women have access to the altar, that they're performing they're ministering at the sacred altar, and we don't know what that means. We don't know whether it means that they are celebrating Eucharist or whether they're with a male presbyter who is celebrating Eucharist. I mean, we don't really know what it means. But Gelasius seems to have known what it meant, and he didn't like it. So, and this corresponds nicely in chronology and place with this inscription of Leta. Can you put Leta on, please?
Boom.
Yeah. Now, this is a huge inscription. It's body size. It's like over 5 feet long, and it was placed, of course, over the body of this person in the ground in Calabria, and it's about Leta, a woman named Leta, who is a presbytera. Now, could that possibly mean she was simply an older woman? Well, let's look at the whole thing. Sacred to her good name, Leta Presbyter, who lived 40 years, 8 months, 9 days, her husband made this. She preceded him in peace the day before the Ides of May, so May 14th. Her husband made this, and her husband does not identify himself as a presbyter.
Hmm.
So she's not the wife of a presbyter and therefore
Hmm.
just has that title. He acknowledges her title of presbytera, and it seems as if he does not have a similar title. So it's intriguing, and matches, as I said, nicely place and time for that letter of Gelasius.
Right.
So something was going on in South Italy in which women were exercising a ministry of presbyter that they were probably not doing elsewhere.
Hmm.
We have a few other pieces of evidence for women presbyters, but that's the best one.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay. So I'm going back to my notes here.
Mhm.
Alrighty. So yeah, there's evidence for women presbyters. So yeah, there's a question of like the difference between a woman and a man presbyter. Was there a difference there that we see in how they led or how they did their role?
We wish we knew more. Uh,
Hmm.
what you see is what you get, basically.
Mm.
And so it's up to us to guess. Remembering the fact that there were a bunch of bishops who didn't like what was going on.
Hmm.
so something, they had some kind of a role that was allowed in some local communities,
Mm,
and the bishops didn't like it, you know.
mm,
So, which probably meant that it was a more expanded kind of leadership role than was usual in other places for women.
mm.
You know?
Yeah, I see. Um, yeah, no, well, there's a lot of epigraphical evidence, right? Or what is epigraphical? Is that writing or is that like
Inscription,
inscription? Yeah,
inscription.
inscription. That's
Mhm,
what I thought. Yeah.
mhm,
So there's a lot of epigraphical evidence for presbyters, like angel of Epicto presbyter, like just
mhm,
very
mhm.
vague, short phrases like that.
Yeah, that's right. And that was on her tombstone.
Hmm.
So what does that mean? It's unlikely that it means she was old. It more likely means that that was a title that she had.
Hmm.
What did it mean? What was she doing? We don't know, because we don't really know what any presbyter was doing at that point. You see, they
Oh
were
wow.
female.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. You're going to go to widows, I think, too, aren't you?
Yeah, yeah. In a second
Yeah.
here.
Before we do that,
Mhm.
yeah, sorry, I was thinking, let's put up the picture of Guilia Runa.
Okay. And it is what is her role?
She's a presbyterissa.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, Guilia could be a misspelling for Julia with a G.
Hmm.
And that would make it a more Latin word. Guilia is certainly not a Latin name, nor is Runa. Runa is not. She's a presbyterissa. Quiebit in pace vixit annis and 50. So she's so presbyterissa, now not only presbytera, but a different feminine ending, presbyterissa. And she died at the age of 50. So this is from the Church of St. Augustine in Hippo, but it's from the Vandal period, from after the 430s, when the Vandals, who were, a tribal, Christian tribal group, had come across Europe and down through Spain and into North Africa.
Hmm.
We know very little about the Vandal Church. It was traditionally Arian. Um, but we just don't know much about their liturgy or their organization or anything. But it seems as if they had female presbyters,
Hmm.
because here we have the example, the nice mosaic burial of one of them. So
Hmm.
that's just another piece to look at,
Yeah.
another image.
Yeah. So another really interesting one is the Montanus, or I don't know how you
Mhm.
pronounce that specifically.
Yeah.
But like someone like John of Damascus, he says they give leadership to women and honor some as priests. The
Mhm.
confection of the Eucharist from the blood of a child is, we recall, also attributed to the, other people. So could you talk about them? Like, what role did they play? Do we know much about, like, where did they have presbyters or
Montanus?
deacons?
Montanus?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a sort of a charismatic revival that begins in mid-second century Phrygia in present-day Turkey, Asia
Okay.
Minor, and spread, and it was known for the prophetic leadership of women. Now, prophecy is something we haven't even talked about, and that was not something we got into in the book. But there was always the acknowledgement that women could be prophets, female prophets, because
Hmm.
prophecy is a gift of the Spirit, and whoever the Spirit chooses can exercise prophecy. And the so Montanism was known for its charismatic belief in the visible, tangible gifts of the Spirit, tongues, prophecy, and yeah, and this illusion you had about blood of children. That's something that groups threw back at each other, back and forth all the time. There's nothing to that. But it was a very powerful movement. It went as far as North Africa. Tertullian
Hmm.
in Carthage
Right.
became a Montanist. So Yeah, so Montanism is something that to look to when you're looking more broadly at the leadership of women.
Mm. Yeah, Tertullian's really fun because like he seems to hate the idea of women leaders, but he also kind of like joined the group, so there's an
Yeah,
interesting discussion there.
yeah.
The Epiphanius, I guess he mentions them as well when he talks about their justification for women being leaders,
Hmm.
and he mentions that Priscilla was a founder, and he quotes Galatians 3:28, for in
Yeah.
Christ Jesus there is neither male nor female,
Hmm.
and um,
Yeah,
but there's also, what
the
were you gonna
whole
say?
biblical argument that they use. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There was a weird one. They mentioned something about special grace to Eve because she ate the tree first,
Uh-huh.
which is,
Uh-huh.
I don't know how you get that justification there. But there's all kinds of other justifications that he mentions. But like this is a like a I guess a critique of them, right? So we know a lot about them from the I guess the more traditional ones, the anti-Montanists that
Mhm. That's right.
were, so like I guess there's a question of like, how accurate is their portrayal of them, but we can still be confident that there were definitely like women leaders in this
Yes.
group.
Yes, yes. How accurate is their portrayal? I mean, when they say that these people were way off because they had women leaders, you can trust that they know that. What those women leaders were doing and how they were understood in their own
Mm,
community is another thing. You just
yeah.
don't know. I mean, that's the story of all of the history of the early church. Is that so much of our information from some groups comes from those who were opposed to them?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes things difficult because you have a lot of people that, like, we even have examples of people not like, I don't know, the word strawmanning, like they're not representing the people they're critiquing well. So
Yeah. Yeah.
it's hard to tell what people even believe then. Um,
Hmm. Hmm.
but that, of course, that happens now as well.
It sure does.
Yeah, so it's not like anything's changed there.
No.
Um, but yeah, so was there anything else you thought was oh yes, I was going to ask you about the Montans. So
Widows too.
yeah, widows as well, but specifically Montanists. So were, I guess maybe in the specifically the Catholic Church, how do people approach that? Like, are they just like a bunch of heretics that, they're not an example for us, or they were just a
Yeah.
confused group, or how do people approach that?
Yeah. You're talking about in sort of mainstream Catholicism now?
Yeah, yeah, just people you've approached in church history that I guess,
Oh, in
um,
church history. No, I think there are people who are, I know there are people who are very, very interested in the Montanists and
mhm,
want to know more. I mean, there's a tradition in the middle, a tradition, I shouldn't say that. There's epigraphical evidence in Asia Minor, in Phrygia, exactly where the Montanists originated,
mhm,
of funerary monuments that say Christiani Christianois, Christians for Christians.
hmm,
And that meant something that to the contemporaries that we don't know what it was. And we think that that was a Montanist uh, slogan or a motto or
hmm,
something. But you guess at it. So historians are very interested in them. From the point of view of sort of an official Catholic position, it would be that they were it was a fringe group,
hmm,
that didn't leave a lasting effect.
mhm. Yeah. So I guess what makes me curious is like, hey, if we know that there were women that were leaders in this time period,
Hmm.
um, I guess there's a lot of people that say, hey, like, there were no women leaders, but clearly there were.
Hmm.
I guess someone would have to say, hey, like they're not part of the group that we care about, like, you know,
Hmm.
that we don't have a specific like a church manuscript that says like these are the rules, and women can be leaders,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
That anyone finds to have a type of authority. Um, Is that all there is? Like, why do people just disregard them so easily?
because they want to.
Oh, okay.
We all argue on the basis of evidence that supports our own position, don't we?
Sure.
I think that's true everywhere.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, of course you could say like, hey, that this is what the Bible says, and this is an example of a group that we're going against the Bible.
Mhm.
Um, but I mean,
Oh,
what
they would never have said they were going against the Bible. Oh my gosh, the Montanists,
yeah, right.
they're being faithful to the Bible. They're being faithful to the gift
Mm,
of the Holy Spirit. You know,
mm,
that's yeah. Church history is an interesting field.
mm. Oh, for sure, for sure.
Yeah, we
So,
haven't get to widows
yeah.
yet, though.
Uh-huh. So like you're not aware of any like justification, like there's no official justification from the Catholic Church that says like, hey, uh, these Montanists, like, we're going to disregard them, but they just like not really talked about.
They're not talked about.
Okay.
No.
Interesting. Okay. And does the Catholic Church, is there a specific set of documents that they say, hey, we should use this in determining who's going to be the leaders of the church, or
Well,
how does
that's a
that
pretty
work?
big question. um, if you're talking about, for instance, women deacons, there have been two commissions recently
Mm,
to study that, and their conclusions have not been made public. But that's an ongoing question for years. It's been talked about.
mm,
Nothing done.
hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I was reading and I was really fascinated that, there's a whole debate among that. It's not settled,
Mhm.
at this moment, at least.
That's
Uh,
right. Mhm.
so yeah, let's talk about the widows. So, I've heard some people say that widows might have been presbyters. Um, what was a widow? Could you talk
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, you see this already in First Timothy. This group of widows, somebody should be chosen, enrolled as a widow who is a
Uh-huh.
certain age, and she's given good example, and she's washed the feet of the saints and given hospitality. Da, 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 da. So it seems as if there is already a kind of a service organization of widows, which could be something that are really that had arisen from Judaism. There's probably the same kind of a custom there, um, because it's widows who are financially stressed, because they've lost their source of income, and their family can't take them back, or won't, or whatever. And so it's a group of women who are they're both the image of the needy, but at the same time they seem to be people who are now relied on for ministry to women, for giving hospitality, et cetera, et cetera. And and there are a couple of cases in which the widows seem to be um, a comparable, and even maybe a higher status than deaconesses. And there's one case in Tertullian's church in Carthage, in North Africa. Um, Public penitents, people who are doing public penance for adultery, apostasy, that kind of thing,
Mm,
uh, to be accepted back into the community, they are presented before the presbyters and the widows. So it sounds as if the widows are part of the consultative body, And then we have this document that's probably fifth, sixth century, called the Testamentum Domini. Um, it's in Syriac, not Latin, and there are deaconesses, but the widows are the ones who have more authority, and have a higher status. So there are just these references every once in a while to widows as the group that does the same thing that the deaconesses do.
hmm.
And it may be that in specific churches, the term is simply different. you know. So you have to take into account widows as well,
Hmm.
not only as place as the group the needy, and widows and orphans. That's a biblical expression, which, by the way, doesn't orphans there is not children with no parent; it's children without a father, and
Hmm.
that's why widows and orphans go together. So not only as needy
Hmm.
people, but also as this kind of service organization, and then a leadership organization sometimes. So it's another piece to throw into the pot.
Interesting. Yeah, so like there's one text you talked about in your book, Testamentum Domini
Yeah, Testamentum
1.41.
Domini. Yeah,
Yeah. And it
Testament.
says the ordination, the word is ordinatio of a widow should occur like this, while she's praying at the entrance of the altar and looking downward, yada yada yada.
Mhm.
So it seems like her role is to pray. Is that right? Is that
Yeah,
the main role
well,
there, or?
yeah, but elsewhere in that text,
Mm,
they are the people who are kind of in an advisory role.
mm,
But it is the language of ordination there. Yeah. So what does ordination mean?
mm. Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting because if I look at the word widow, I'm not going to think like a church role
That's
or
right.
anything like that.
That's right.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's something weird going on with the text you guys talked about where there's different ages for
Mhm.
when one would be a widow.
Yeah.
Is it the Apostle Paul or somewhere in the New Testament where there's a specific age given, or is that later
First
on?
Timothy. First
First
Timothy.
Timothy.
Yeah.
Okay.
I, I should have checked that passage. I think it's 60.
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure. Yeah, and the age keeps shifting. Um, and remember that life expectancy was not what it is with us today.
Hmm.
60, when you get to 60, you're old, and
Yeah.
it's so you kind of wonder, was that a way to sort of thin out the ranks? Only those who survived long enough.
You're right. Yeah, that's really fascinating. So, I guess the idea is that hey, if you get old enough, and there were other texts that were pretty young or younger at least than
Yeah,
60,
yeah.
but when you get around the specific age, like hey, this person is wise enough, they're smart enough, or
Enough life experience, I guess.
uh,
Yeah. Hmm.
yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. Hmm. Okay. So let's see here. Yep. Yeah. Okay. So maybe you already answered this, but is there any evidence that either women presbyters, widows, or female deacons would have taught in church? So maybe not even specifically like a sermon, but like was there like a kids Bible study
Yeah,
or was there
women and
women's
children,
group?
yes. Women and children, yes,
Okay.
definitely. Yeah.
Okay. And
Um,
what were you gonna say?
yeah, the female deacons, that was part of their role. Mhm.
Okay. Alrighty. But not the presbyters. I guess we don't know a lot about,
We just
right?
don't know enough about the
Yeah.
presbytery.
Okay. That's great.
Yeah,
Yeah.
unfortunately.
Yeah, I see. And was there any other teaching roles that they would have ever? I guess there's some situation where like they like give the gospel to people, right?
Yeah. Oh, I think there's one text from Syria. I don't remember what it is anymore, where women are doing the reading of the gospel.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, women presbyters. Yeah,
Hmm. But that wouldn't have been
one particular place.
but I guess that just depends on what how you define the word teaching then. Um,
Yeah, that's right.
yeah, that's tricky there.
It's
Um,
tricky. You're right.
Interesting. Okay, yeah. Well, that's really all the questions I have for you. Was there anything else that you wanted to add to that discussion? Things that you thought maybe should be worth mentioning?
Just that I'm thankful to you for your interest in this, and I would encourage you to continue it. I give you some possible ways to do that,
Hmm.
um, because it is a lively discussion today,
Hmm.
and there are people who could contribute a lot for you.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. So people, we talked about Phoebe a lot. I did an interview with someone else on that topic, so you can
Mhm.
check that out on the channel. That'll be in the description. But otherwise, you can check out Miss Osek's book here, where she documents all of the evidence. There was a lot of stuff we did not talk about today that was really interesting there. Oh, one more question. Okay,
Well,
so
when you reference
yeah.
the book, I also want to say my co-author's name, Kevin Madigan.
Yes, Kevin Madigan. There you go. All right. Um, there was one other thing I wanted to ask,
Mhm.
and it's okay if you already answered this, but the difference between Orthodox churches and heterodox churches, was that something that was well defined back then, or is heterodox, is that just a word for, uh,
Heresy.
yeah, just
The word
heresy?
for heresy. Yeah.
And that would be someone like the Montanists that,
Yes. Yes. And
okay.
remember, when you're using the word orthodox, that it's the generic meaning of that with a small o. Okay.
Mm.
It means right teaching. It means basically it means us.
Right,
We have the truth.
right.
Whereas capital O, remember, that's the whole Eastern tradition of
Uh-huh.
Christianity. It's quite
Yeah.
quite a different thing.
Yeah. Oh, there was one more thing that was really interesting. It's okay if you don't have an answer for this. So there is the text from like the 8th or ninth century. Let's see here, where there's the guy that is sending a letter, and he's like, "Hey, there was these women leaders way back when."
Yeah, Otto Vercelli. Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, he is looking back centuries before and saying, giving a very positive spin that yeah, it's clear that there were women leaders who were doing this, and we don't anymore.
mm,
So why don't we think about it?
mm.
Mm.
Yeah. So on that topic, it was really interesting because he seems to be okay with it. Like
Yeah,
he's um
he's in
uh
a church that most people aren't okay with it.
yeah. So would you say that there were some people during church history that were okay with it even though those weren't the specific rules? Is that good evidence of that, or how would you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, there are good historians who look back and said, well, this used to be, so why aren't we doing it today?
Hmm. Interesting. But we don't really see much of a push for that, like, hey, for changing the
No,
rules of
well,
women
in
leaders.
the Orthodox Church now, in the Greek Orthodox Church, my understanding is that they have reinstituted the office of deaconess some years ago. And I'm not up on that. Maybe
Okay.
you can find somebody else who is. I don't know how it's going, but I do know that that decision was made.
Mm, interesting. Yeah, that's very interesting. Okay. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you. I really do enjoy having you on here, and I'm sure a lot of people are going to get a lot out of this. Yeah, definitely check out her work, everybody. Was there any other works that you've written that you wanted people to know about, or things that you're doing in the scholarly world?
Oh, gee. I guess the book on women in house churches would be also
Oh,
one
yes.
would be that people enjoy looking at, I think.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Also
that'll be a
written
good
some
one.
time ago, but yeah,
Yeah, there you go. Well,
I'm
very
retired now.
there you go. That's okay. All right. Well, yeah, thank you so much for coming on. And otherwise, I do hope you have a great rest of your day.
Okay. Thank you, Zach.
Yeah,
Bye.
much appreciated.
Mhm.